The man carried nothing but a book and a boarding pass. No briefcase full of secrets, no phone glued to his hand, no nervous glances toward security. Just calm, measured stillness. But to one woman at the gate, that quiet was the most suspicious thing she'd seen all morning. Minutes later, a world-renowned United Nations legal advisor would be in handcuffs, humiliated before takeoff. The irony? He had spent his entire life writing the very laws those officers were about to break. It began like any other delay. The 7:15 a.m. flight from London Heathrow to New York had been pushed back 45 minutes because of heavy fog drifting over the Atlantic. In Terminal 5, the usual symphony of rolling suitcases, boarding calls, and clinking coffee cups filled the air. No one paid attention to anyone else. Travelers scrolled, sipped, sighed, and waited. Among them stood a man who, by all appearances, did nothing remarkable. Professor Aidan Baptiste, 64 years old, stood in the business class line, shoulders relaxed, eyes resting on the pages of a worn paperback. The faint scent of cedar from his navy wool trench coat mingled with the sterile chill of the terminal air. His gray trousers were perfectly pressed, his salt and pepper beard trimmed close to his jaw. Everything about him was neat but unpretentious, elegant in the way a man becomes after decades of discipline. He was used to travel, used to the rhythm of airports, the waiting, the wandering, the strange quiet between departures. He'd given lectures in 40 countries, advised committees on 4 continents, and spent the last month at The Hague drafting revisions to international counterterrorism law. But this morning, he was just another passenger. Calm, anonymous, invisible, or so he believed. A slim leather carry-on rested by his feet. A black laptop bag crossed one shoulder. A crisp boarding pass peeked from his inner pocket. His phone lay face down in his palm, untouched. He wasn't scrolling through headlines or messages. He was reading, rereading something that demanded thought. A transcript, lines of testimony from a war crime tribunal in Kyiv, annotated in blue ink. His focus was absolute. But in another corner of the lounge, his silence had already become noise. By the tall glass windows sat Veronica Hall, mid-50s, her blonde hair perfectly set, her diamond earrings catching the pale morning light. She exuded the kind of confidence money breeds, refined, assertive, slightly brittle. Her husband, George, sat beside her scrolling through his phone, half listening, half elsewhere. Veronica wasn't half anywhere. Her gaze had fixed on Aidan for several minutes now. On the stillness, the absence of movement, the quiet posture that didn't match her understanding of normal. He wasn't jittery like the tourists or chatty like the business travelers. He was simply there, unreadable. And to Veronica, unreadable meant dangerous. She leaned toward the gate attendant with the practiced tone of someone used to being obeyed. "That man," she whispered, gesturing with her chin. "The one in the long coat. Something's off. He's been watching everyone. Too quiet. Too calculated." The young attendant blinked, confused. "Ma'am, he's just in the business class queue. He cleared security like everyone else." Veronica's voice sharpened. "I travel enough to know what I feel. Just report it, before it's too late." That was all it took. 7 words passed from lips to radio, transmuted by the machinery of assumption into a matter of airport security. At 7:36 a.m., 2 officers stationed near gate B16 received the alert. Suspicious passenger, male, mid-60s, possibly casing the area. No visible threat yet. For Deputy Officer Luke Raleigh, that was gospel. Tall, square-jawed, barely 30, Raleigh was the type who mistook instinct for truth and authority for righteousness. He cracked his knuckles, straightened his vest, and nodded to his partner. Officer Neil Watson, older and quieter, followed with slower steps. He had seen enough false alarms to tread carefully, but he didn't argue. Not today. Orders were orders. They didn't ask who filed the complaint. They didn't review camera footage. They didn't even check the man's name. Why would they? To them, suspicion was reason enough. Aidan moved forward in line, passport and ID ready in hand. The overhead speakers announced pre-boarding. The low hum of conversation continued. Then he felt it, the subtle shift of air behind him. Two shadows, one on each side. He turned, calmly, and met them with steady eyes. "Sir," Raleigh said, voice clipped. "We need to speak with you." Aiden tilted his head slightly. "About?" "We've received a complaint," Watson added, avoiding eye contact. "You're making other passengers uncomfortable." Aiden blinked once, expression unchanged. "By standing here? Step out of line," Raleigh ordered, already motioning toward Aiden's carry-on. "We need to see your bag." Around them, the quiet murmur of travelers softened into an uneasy hush. A mother pulled her toddler closer. Someone raised a phone, recording. A whisper rippled through the queue. Uncertainty, curiosity, fear. Aiden stepped aside, not out of fear, but out of precision. His mind began to map the moment. Tone, posture, wording, sequence. Every detail would matter later. "My name is Professor Aiden Baptiste," he said evenly. "I'm a legal advisor to the United Nations Human Rights Council. I have cleared every international checkpoint required. What exactly do you suspect me of?" Raleigh smirked faintly. "That's what we're here to find out. Am I under arrest?" "No, sir," Raleigh said, "but your cooperation is required." "Then I'd like your badge numbers before we proceed." That was it, the invisible spark, the quiet assertion of knowledge, the reminder that authority, unchecked, still answers to law. Raleigh's jaw tightened. He stepped closer, close enough that Aiden could smell the faint metallic tang of his breath. "We're not going to do this here," Raleigh hissed. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way." "There's only one lawful way," Aiden replied. And with that, the click of steel cut through the terminal like thunder. Handcuffs. Cold. Final. Unnecessary. Gasps rippled through the waiting area. A child whimpered. Veronica sat back in her seat, satisfied, crossing her legs with self-assured triumph. Her husband didn't even look up from his phone. The gate attendant froze, hand hovering over the desk phone, uncertain whom to call or whether to call at all. But it was too late. Professor Aiden Baptiste, respected legal scholar and architect of international justice frameworks, stood cuffed between two officers in the middle of Heathrow Airport. Not because of anything he did, but because of who he was, how he looked, and because one woman's discomfort was taken as fact. Raleigh gripped his arm too tightly as they walked him through the crowd. The other officer followed behind, eyes darting toward the onlookers who filmed every step. Aiden did not resist. He did not plead. He simply walked, his silence more damning than any accusation. And yet, as they led him down the long corridor toward the airport security wing, his thoughts remained clear. He had studied systems like this his whole life, the ways in which fear disguises itself as duty, how prejudice hides inside protocol. And now, he was walking inside the very machinery he had spent decades warning the world about. The corridor felt colder than the rest of Heathrow. Maybe it was the air conditioning. Maybe it was something else, the chill of humiliation, the sterile hum of bureaucracy at work. Officer Raleigh's grip never loosened. The cuffs stayed tight. The clink of metal against bone punctuated the silence. There was no struggle. There never had been. Aiden didn't ask why this was happening. He already knew. He just didn't expect to become the next case study in his own lectures. The security office was a small gray room lined with metal chairs and a buzzing fluorescent light that flickered every few seconds. Raleigh pushed the door open with his shoulder. "Sit," he ordered. Aiden sat slowly, deliberate in every motion. The cuffs bit into his wrists as he adjusted himself in the chair. Officer Watson stood in the corner, arms crossed, expression tight with unease. His conscience was already beginning to stir. "State your name," Raleigh barked, pulling a clipboard from the wall. "You have my identification," Aiden replied, voice steady, clipped only by restraint. "I asked for your name." "Aiden Baptiste," he said. "Professor. Legal consultant to multiple human rights tribunals, most recently retained by the International Criminal Court in The Hague." Raleigh scribbled something onto the page and muttered, "Possible alias." Watson's eyes flicked up. A flicker of doubt crossed his face. Aiden continued, his tone calm but firm. "What exactly am I being detained for?" "We received a complaint," Raleigh said flatly. Suspicious behavior. You were seen watching people's bags. Were you aware I already cleared both passport control and TSA with no issues? Doesn't matter, Raleigh shot back. That was before we received a report. A report based on whose assessment? Aiden asked quietly. You're getting defensive, sir, Raleigh said, leaning forward. Makes you look guilty. Guilty of what? Aiden asked softly. Of reading in silence. Watson shifted again, fingers twitching against his vest. Aiden noticed, in any courtroom, that small movement would be the first crack in testimony. Here, it was the first hint of conscience. Raleigh smirked. You want to keep playing semantics, Professor? Be my guest. But in this room, I ask the questions. That, Aiden said, his voice low but resonant, is exactly the problem. The sentence landed not as defiance, but as truth, a blade laid quietly on the table. The room fell silent. The fluorescent light buzzed above them. Somewhere down the hall, the intercom announced another delayed boarding call. But inside that small room, something larger had already begun, because power had just met its mirror, and for the first time, it didn't like what it saw. Outside, in the terminal, travelers scrolled through their phones, unaware that one of them had just captured the arrest on camera. The short clip, an older black man, calm, handcuffed, surrounded by officers, would soon find his way online with a caption that read, Asterisk, is this what security looks like now? Asterisk, the world hadn't seen it yet. But within hours, that silence, that calm, that unshakable dignity in Aiden's eyes would ignite something much larger than a misunderstanding. Because what began with one whisper at Gate B16 was about to echo across the world. The small gray room smelled faintly of cold metal and overused coffee. Its walls were lined with scuff marks, its corners filmed with dust. A single fluorescent bulb hummed overhead like an impatient witness. The kind of room built not for truth, but for control. Officer Luke Raleigh pushed Aiden Baptiste into the chair with more force than needed. The steel cuffs clinked against the tabletop. He didn't look at him, just turned, shut the door, and let the echo of the latch fill the silence. Sit, Raleigh barked, though Aiden was already sitting. The professor adjusted his posture, deliberate and slow, the cuffs biting slightly into his wrists. Across the room, Officer Neil Watson stood with arms crossed, leaning against the corner wall. His face was tight, his eyes uncertain. He'd been in rooms like this before, but something about this man, his composure, his stillness, made this feel different. Raleigh snapped open a clipboard. State your name, for the record. Aiden's voice was calm. You have my identification. I asked for your name, Raleigh repeated. Aiden Baptiste, he said evenly. Professor, legal consultant to multiple international tribunals. Recently retained by the International Criminal Court in The Hague. Raleigh scribbled something, muttering under his breath, possible alias. Watson's brow furrowed. The words didn't fit. Possible alias? The man in front of them didn't carry himself like a liar. He carried himself like someone used to being listened to. Aiden broke the silence first. What exactly am I being detained for? Raleigh didn't look up. We received a complaint. Suspicious behavior. You were seen watching people's bags. Were you aware, Aiden asked, that I cleared every security checkpoint, passport control, and TSA screen without a single flag? Doesn't matter, Raleigh said, waving his hand. That was before we got a report. A report from whom? Someone concerned for public safety. Raleigh leaned forward, eyes narrowing. You getting defensive, sir? Makes you look guilty. Aiden tilted his head slightly. Guilty of what? Reading in silence. Watson shifted, uncomfortable. Raleigh ignored him. Look, he said, voice rising. You can keep talking circles, but in this room, I ask the questions. Aiden met his stare. And that, he said softly, is exactly the problem. The air thickened. Even the hum of the fluorescent bulb seemed to falter. Raleigh's jaw clenched. He was used to fear, not composure. Used to people breaking, not holding steady. Outside the door, footsteps passed. The terminal beyond buzzed with routine life. But inside, the clock ticked with the slow inevitability of truth. The minutes stretched. Raleigh paced, asking questions with no answers behind them. Where Aiden was headed, why he was traveling alone, what he'd been reading, why he looked so calm. Each question revealed more about Raleigh's assumptions than Aiden's actions. Aiden watched him with the focus of a man taking notes in his own trial. Every word, every inflection, every procedural failure etched itself in his mind. Later, he would remember all of it. Finally, he spoke. "You haven't stated the legal grounds for my detainment. You're being questioned under suspicion of monitoring passengers," Raleigh snapped. "Possible reconnaissance behavior." "Reconnaissance?" Aiden repeated, eyebrows lifting slightly. "In an airport filled with cameras, uniformed officers, and glass walls? That's your assessment?" Raleigh's patience cracked. "Watch the tone, Professor." Watson finally stepped forward. "Maybe we should verify his credentials," he murmured. Raleigh shot him a look that could slice through steel. "I'll handle this." But Watson didn't back down. He reached for Aiden's ID, slid it through the small terminal scanner near the wall, and waited. The machine blinked once, then beeped, a soft, unimpeachable sound. Result asterisk. UK residency verified. UN identification tag recognized. Legal credentials confirmed. Watson's breath hitched. "Sir, it checks out." Raleigh snatched the ID back, refusing to look. "We'll confirm that through official channels. We're not done here." Aiden lifted his cuffed wrists, resting them gently on the table. "No, officer, you are." The tone in his voice wasn't defiant. It was final. Rooted. The kind of tone that ends arguments in courtrooms and leaves echoes behind in memory. Watson swallowed hard. "Maybe we should," but the knock at the door cut him off. 3 sharp raps. Raleigh turned. "We're in the middle of." The door opened anyway. A tall man in a black overcoat stepped in, holding a silver badge against the glass. His voice was precise, controlled, carrying the weight of command. Asterisk, asterisk, Agent Declan Rodas. International Legal Oversight Division. Asterisk, asterisk, you're detaining a United Nations affiliated legal officer without jurisdiction or cause. This stops now. Raleigh straightened, instinctively defensive. "We're conducting an internal investigation." "You're conducting an unlawful detainment," Declan interrupted. "We've been contacted by the U.S. Consulate, Interpol, and the Hague's Emergency Oversight Desk. You're holding a man who trains judges on the Geneva Conventions." The room froze. Watson looked down. Raleigh's lips parted, but no words came out. Declan's tone didn't rise. It didn't need to. He turned toward Aiden. "We've confirmed your identity, Professor Baptiste. We're prepared to escort you under international protocol. Do you require medical evaluation?" "I do not," Aiden replied. "But I do require documentation, full report, badge numbers, and immediate removal of these restraints." Raleigh hesitated, eyes flicking between Declan and Aiden. Watson moved first. His hands trembled as he reached forward to unlock the cuffs. I apologize, sir," he stammered. Aiden looked him directly in the eye. "You didn't ask, officer. But now that you know, what you do next matters more." The words hung there, heavier than shame. Declan turned to Raleigh. "You'll be contacted by Internal Affairs. I suggest you retain counsel." Raleigh's throat tightened, but he said nothing. Aiden rose slowly. He didn't adjust his coat with pride, nor did he glare with anger. He simply straightened, calm, as before, the same composure that had been mistaken for threat, now radiating as strength. He walked past them, his footsteps echoing down the sterile hallway. No one stopped him this time. No one dared. Behind him, silence filled the room, the heavy kind that doesn't fade when the door closes. Watson exhaled first. Raleigh just stood there, staring at his empty hands, realizing too late what power looks like when it's earned, not given. Outside, the airport resumed its rhythm, scanners flashing, luggage wheels rolling, voices rising and fading like tides. To the average traveler, nothing had changed. But inside Heathrow's walls, something had cracked. At the operations hub, Agent Declan Rodas stood tall before a desk scattered with reports. 2 officers sat across from him, Raleigh and Watson, alongside a third man in a gray suit from airport administration. The air was thick, sterile, and uncomfortably quiet. Declan opened a file. Let's review. You detained a passenger with no criminal record, no flagged items, and a verified ticket, based solely on a single woman's statement of concern. No specifics, no corroboration, nothing but her word. He was watching the bags, Raleigh said, voice small now, almost rehearsed. Declan raised an eyebrow. Do you mean sitting beside his own luggage? Because that's what the footage shows. Raleigh blinked. You reviewed all of it, Declan said sharply. Gate cameras, security feeds, timestamps. There was no circling, no loitering, no erratic behavior. He didn't move from his seat for 30 minutes. Watson shifted in his chair. His jaw worked, but no words came out. Declan slid a photograph across the table, a press image of Aiden standing before the United Nations emblem, flanked by global dignitaries. The caption read, Professor Aiden Baptiste, Lead Legal Counsel, International Commission on Human Rights. Had you taken 60 seconds to run a proper check, Declan said coldly, this is what you would have found. Raleigh looked down at the photo. Aiden's calm, unwavering face stared back, composed even in stillness. It was unbearable. You put handcuffs, Declan continued, on a man who has written constitutional oversight frameworks in over 10 countries. Watson cleared his throat. We didn't know who he was. That, Declan interrupted, is the point. You didn't ask. You assumed. The silence that followed was suffocating. Outside, the world was already reacting. Another officer stepped in, holding a tablet. Sir, he said to Declan, the footage just went viral. Over 500,000 views in under an hour. Major networks are already reporting. Declan turned the screen toward Raleigh and Watson. The headline burned across the display. Human rights expert wrongfully detained at Heathrow, captured on video. The thumbnail showed Aiden standing still, hands bound, eyes forward, unbroken. Congratulations, Declan said quietly. You've turned your instincts into an international scandal. Raleigh's stomach twisted. He wanted to speak, to defend himself, but the words caught somewhere between pride and disbelief. Watson just stared at the screen, his face pale. Outside the operations room, travelers who had recorded the arrest uploaded clear footage. Witnesses tagged journalists. Aiden's name began trending, not just as a victim, but as a symbol. A line of accountability was drawing itself in real time. Meanwhile, back in the terminal, Veronica Hall sat by the same window where it all began. The planes took off one after another, their engines roaring into the fog. She didn't look up at them. Her phone buzzed relentlessly. Messages, news alerts, links. A friend had sent her one of the videos. She tapped the screen and froze. There he was, the man she'd whispered about, the man she'd feared for no reason at all. His name, his credentials, his speech clips, all flashing across the news ticker. One headline read, UN legal advisor detained after false report at Heathrow. Her reflection in the glass looked pale. The weight of her whisper settled in her chest. She hadn't meant for it to go this far. She only wanted him moved. Now, the world was moving against her. In the lounge, murmurs spread. Someone pointed. Another whispered. A journalist nearby typed the first lines of an article that would soon go viral. The cost of a whisper. How fear at Gate B16 sparked a diplomatic incident. Veronica lowered her head. The crowd's eyes were on her now. And somewhere beyond the crowd, in a quiet briefing room, Aiden Baptiste stood tall beside Agent Declan Rodas. The cuffs were gone, but the marks on his wrists remained, a reminder not of defeat, but of purpose. Because what had happened in that room wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of accountability. And Aiden, calm as ever, was already preparing his next move. The story should have ended there. An apology, a quiet correction, maybe a line buried deep in some airport incident report. But injustice has a way of refusing to stay silent, especially when caught on camera. By the time Aiden Baptiste stepped out of that gray interrogation room, the world had already seen him. A short, shaky clip recorded by a teenage passenger had spread across social media like wildfire. A black man in a gray coat, handcuffed, surrounded by officers, standing calm and unbroken while the crowd whispered. The caption was simple but damning. Asterisk, is this what security looks like now? Asterisk. Within 20 minutes, the video had 15,000 views. By the hour's end, it was 500,000. By noon, it had reached every major newsroom in London and New York. Inside Heathrow's operations center, screens flickered with feeds of terminals and live news alerts. Agent Declan Rodas stood at the center of it all, back straight, expression unreadable. Beside him sat officers Luke Raleigh and Neil Watson, both suspended mid-briefing, both visibly shaken. "Let's review what we know," Declan began, his tone calm but cold. "You detained a passenger who cleared all checkpoints, carried no suspicious items, and possessed verified identification. You acted solely on a verbal claim from one woman who expressed discomfort but provided no evidence." Raleigh opened his mouth. "She said he was watching bags." Declan's voice cut through like a blade. "You mean sitting beside his own luggage?" Raleigh hesitated. She said he looked off." "Off," Declan repeated, leaning forward. "And that was enough for you to apply handcuffs?" Watson lowered his gaze. Declan continued. "We reviewed the footage," he said. "Terminal cameras, gate security feeds, timestamp data. There was no circling, no surveillance pattern, no erratic behavior. The man you detained didn't even move from his spot for half an hour." The room fell silent except for the hum of the monitors. Then Declan slid a photo across the table, a glossy press image. Aiden Baptiste standing before the United Nations emblem, surrounded by dignitaries and jurists. The caption read, "Professor Aiden Baptiste, Lead Legal Counsel, International Commission on Human Rights." Declan's voice softened, but only slightly. "Had you taken 60 seconds to verify his credentials, this is what you would have found. Instead, you put cuffs on a man who has written constitutional oversight frameworks for 10 nations and advised the International Court on War Crimes." Watson swallowed hard. "We didn't know who he was." "That's the point," Declan said quietly. "You didn't ask." No one spoke after that. Outside, the airport buzzed on, oblivious to the reckoning brewing behind its polished glass walls. An hour later, a communications officer burst through the door holding a tablet. "Sir, the footage has passed 1 million views. Major outlets, BBC, Reuters, CNN, are covering it. It's trending under hashtag Heathrow Justice." Declan turned the screen toward Raleigh and Watson. The headline glared in bold. "Human rights expert wrongfully detained at Heathrow, captured on video." The thumbnail showed Aiden's face, calm, composed, wristbound. Behind him, 2 officers. He wasn't resisting. He wasn't shouting. He was simply waiting. Raleigh's throat went dry. He wanted to speak, to justify, to say he was following protocol, but the image said enough. Watson sat still, his eyes glassy with disbelief. Declan exhaled through his nose. "Gentlemen," he said evenly, "you've just become the lesson your training manuals never taught you." Meanwhile, just a few gates away, Veronica Hall sat frozen in her seat by the window. The same spot where it had all started. The same place where her whisper had taken flight. Her phone vibrated endlessly with notifications. News alerts, calls, messages she didn't dare open. Finally, she did. A friend had sent her a link. She tapped the screen and felt her stomach drop. The man she had reported, the quiet one, was now all over the news. His full name, credentials, affiliations. A photo of him speaking at a United Nations summit. A short clip from his TED Talk titled Racial Profiling in European Transit Hubs. The irony struck her like ice. Around her, whispers began to ripple. A teenage girl pointed in her direction. A man near the counter leaned over to another passenger, murmuring her name. Veronica pulled her scarf tighter around her shoulders, but it didn't help. The weight of recognition pressed in from all sides. On the overhead monitors, the story looped again. The same video, the same man, the same headline. And, suddenly, she wasn't invisible anymore. Her whisper had a face now, hers. Upstairs in the Heathrow Media Lounge, a journalist for The Guardian was already typing the headline that would soon circle the globe. The cost of a whisper, how fear at Gate B16 sparked a diplomatic crisis. By evening, the article would become one of the most shared stories of the year. It described not just Aiden's arrest, but the chain reaction it set off. Questions of bias, accountability, and authority in transit systems long accused of racial profiling. The journalist ended with a line that would later appear on protest signs across London. Asterisk, the real danger wasn't the man in the coat. It was the system that believed the whisper. Asterisk. In a conference room below the main terminal, Agent Declan Rodas stood beside Aiden Baptiste. The room was crowded with officials from airport legal, Crown Security, and the Metropolitan Oversight Board. Reporters had been kept out, but everyone knew the story had already escaped containment. Declan turned toward Aiden. "Sir, we're prepared to issue a public statement immediately if you wish." Aiden rose from his seat, his posture steady, his eyes calm as stone. "Not yet," he said. "There's something more important than what I have to say." One of the officials frowned. "And what is that, Professor?" "That you listen," Aiden replied. "Not just to me, but to what your system allowed and enabled. Because unless that changes, this won't be the last time." The silence that followed wasn't defensive. It was dawning comprehension. Everyone in the room felt it. The quiet weight of undeniable truth. Declan finally spoke. "For the record," he said clearly, addressing the assembled officers, "this is Professor Aiden Baptiste, legal advisor to the United Nations, recipient of the Global Human Rights Medal, and senior architect of multiple international legal charters." Raleigh exhaled sharply, his composure collapsing. Watson sat down, rubbing his temples. And Aiden, calm, unshaken, simply nodded. He turned to leave, and no one stopped him. No one dared. The cameras outside followed him silently, not as spectacle, but as witness. The man who had walked into that airport, invisible, now walked out unforgettable. But while Aiden left Heathrow, Heathrow could not leave him. In the days that followed, the footage dominated every feed, every talk show, every front page. Editorial boards demanded reform. Politicians scrambled for statements. Even world leaders weighed in, some with apology, others with deflection. Aiden didn't do interviews. He didn't appear on television. He stayed quiet, letting the footage speak for itself. He knew that anger fades faster than understanding. If he wanted lasting change, he had to channel both. So while the world argued, Aiden planned. A week later, in a glass conference room overlooking the Thames, he sat across from 5 officials. 2 from the Crown Prosecution Service, 1 from the Metropolitan Police Oversight Board, and 2 observers from the International Civil Liberties Alliance. The meeting was confidential, but its weight was historic. Aiden didn't pace or lecture. He spoke the way he always had, calm, precise, surgical. He recounted the incident step by step, from the moment Veronica whispered to the cold metal around his wrists. He named no villains. He described systems, habits, and assumptions. This wasn't an error, he said. It was a process, flawed by design, defended by habit. A woman at the table, a barrister named Lynette Hayes, leaned forward. "You're saying the officers didn't act alone?" "I'm saying," Aiden replied, "they acted with the full confidence of a system that never required them to ask better questions. They were taught to fear shadows, not verify facts." Behind the glass, 2 ethics auditors scribbled furiously in their notebooks. This wasn't testimony, it was diagnosis. By the next morning, excerpts from Aiden's closed-door statement had leaked to the press. Headlines read, Asterisk, Baptiste calls for systemic review of transit security bias. Asterisk, asterisk, UN legal advisor urges accountability over anger. Asterisk, the coverage was relentless. Hashtags multiplied. Civil rights groups mobilized. Protesters gathered outside Heathrow holding signs that read asterisk, listen, don't assume. Asterisk, but Aiden refused to let it become just another wave of outrage. He'd seen what happened to movements built on anger alone. They burned bright, then faded. He wanted something that lasted, so he built it. From the inner pocket of his jacket, he produced a slim leather folder containing a draft proposal, what he called the Transit Justice Initiative. It was a framework designed to hold transportation law enforcement accountable to international standards of civil liberty. It called for independent review panels, mandatory anti-bias recertification every 12 months, transparent complaint tracking, and citizen access to audit reports. He slid the pages across the table. "I wrote this on the flight home," he said quietly. "This is not a reaction. It's a blueprint." The room was still. No one expected the man they had handcuffed at Gate B16 to return with legislation. No one expected the victim to come back as the architect of reform. Meanwhile, back in Heathrow's Internal Affairs Division, officers Raleigh and Watson sat in separate interview rooms. Their uniforms were gone, replaced by plain clothes. But the weight of their decisions hung heavier than any badge. Raleigh stared at a printed photo of Aiden, calm, cuffed, dignified, the image that had circled the world. His throat felt tight. He'd built his career on instincts, on split-second judgment. But now those instincts sat in his chest like stones. Across the table, an ethics investigator leaned forward. "Officer Raleigh, when you approached Mr. Baptiste, what did you know about him?" "Nothing," Raleigh muttered. "Nothing, just what the woman said. She said he looked, what, exactly?" Raleigh hesitated. "Off." The investigator circled the word. "And you didn't question that?" "I didn't think I had to." The investigator leaned back. "And that, Officer Raleigh, is the problem." As the investigation deepened, Aiden's proposal gained traction. Legal institutions across Europe requested drafts. Law schools asked him to guest lecture on the case. Editorials called it the Heathrow Doctrine, a global template for accountability in modern policing. But Aiden never called it that. He didn't want his name on a doctrine. He wanted his name on progress. Every public statement he made ended with the same sentence: "We cannot fix what we refuse to document. We cannot restore trust in silence." And so, from the ashes of humiliation rose something far larger, a movement rooted not in rage, but in resolve. The man who had been mistaken for a threat became the teacher of those who feared him. The whisper that had condemned him became the echo that awakened a system. Heathrow would never look the same again. The air in the conference chamber was still. Not quiet, just heavy. The kind of stillness that arrives after too much has been said, and yet not enough has been understood. At the far end of a long oak table sat Professor Aiden Baptiste, hands no longer bound, but the faint red marks around his wrists remained, a silent echo of what had happened in that gray room at Heathrow. Across from him were 5 officials, 2 from the Crown Prosecution Service, 1 from the Metropolitan Police Internal Oversight Board, and 2 observers dispatched by the International Civil Liberties Alliance. They weren't here to discuss optics anymore. This was about something deeper, something systemic. This was about how an airport had become a mirror, and what it reflected was rot. Aiden didn't pace. He didn't pound the table or raise his voice. He sat straight, his gaze steady, his words clipped with precision. His calm wasn't resignation. It was structure. It was law taking human form. "Let's begin where the damage started," he said, his voice firm but measured. "A complaint made without evidence. A report accepted without verification. And an arrest made without cause. At every level, a safeguard failed because assumption replaced inquiry." The officials said nothing. Some scribbled notes. Others stared at their hands. Aiden continued. "This wasn't an isolated act of misconduct. It was the product of an environment that rewards reaction over reflection. You've built systems that mistake bias for instinct and compliance for security." One of the Crown representatives shifted uncomfortably. "Professor, are you implying the officers acted under institutional encouragement?" "I'm not implying," Aiden said, looking up. "I'm diagnosing." The silence thickened. Every syllable seemed to land heavier than the last. From behind the observation glass, 2 ethics auditors took notes rapidly. They weren't documenting just a statement. They were recording a case study, the anatomy of systemic blindness. Aiden leaned forward slightly. "The law cannot protect what it refuses to acknowledge. What happened at Heathrow wasn't about me. It was about what your systems are trained to see, and more importantly, what they're trained to ignore." A murmur spread among the observers. The woman from the Civil Liberties Alliance, a seasoned barrister named Lynette Hayes, interjected. "You're saying, then, that this isn't a matter of rogue behavior, but of design?" I'm saying, Aiden replied, that the officers did exactly what the system allowed them to do, act on unverified suspicion without accountability. He paused, letting that sink in. And when a system teaches fear instead of fact, this will happen again. He opened the folder in front of him. Inside were a few sheets of cream-colored paper, handwritten in neat, deliberate script. This, he said, sliding copies across the table, is the beginning of a solution. The header read, Transit Justice Initiative. He let them read for a moment before speaking again. This proposal establishes independent oversight panels for every major transit hub. It mandates annual anti-bias recertification for officers, transparent reporting on all civilian detainments, and third-party review for any arrest initiated by a citizen complaint. Every action must be verifiable. Every assumption must be documented. The man from the oversight board raised an eyebrow. That's ambitious, Professor. Expensive, too. Aiden's expression didn't change. So, is negligence. Lynette Hayes smiled faintly at the precision of that response. She could tell he wasn't here to debate feasibility. He was here to design permanence. He continued, This framework also creates what I call a chain of validation. Before any officer acts on a civilian complaint, they must confirm 3 layers of verification: evidence, corroboration, and proportionality of response. Each must be logged digitally. Failure to do so triggers automatic internal review. A younger official frowned. And what if it delays legitimate intervention? Aiden didn't flinch. Justice was never meant to be convenient. It was meant to be correct. The words cut through the air like a verdict. No one countered them. Across town, the footage of his testimony, though confidential, had already begun to leak through secondary channels. A reporter from The Independent quoted a source inside the meeting who described Aiden's tone as surgical, unflinching, and quietly devastating. Public opinion had shifted from outrage to admiration. People no longer saw him just as the victim at Gate B16. They saw him as something else, a reformer who refused to weaponize his pain. Even critics were forced to admit it. The man they had once handcuffed was now rewriting how power itself would be held accountable. Back in the hearing room, one of the board members cleared his throat. Professor Baptiste, what you're suggesting would require new legislative approval. Are you prepared to lead that process? Aiden nodded. I'm not asking for special authority. I'm asking for shared responsibility. This is not my reform. It belongs to everyone who believes in equal protection under the law. The phrasing was deliberate, elegant, and impossible to dismiss. Lynette leaned in again. What do you propose we call this? She asked. Aiden smiled faintly. Call it what it is. A map out of the rot. Meanwhile, down the hall, the 2 officers whose actions had ignited this firestorm sat in separate interview rooms. Officer Luke Raleigh stared at a printed still image. The viral frame of Aiden standing in cuffs, his face calm, his dignity intact. The same image that had reached millions. The same one now burned into his conscience. The ethics investigator sitting across from him leaned forward. Officer Raleigh, he began, when you approached Mr. Baptiste, what did you actually know about him? Raleigh's voice cracked. Nothing. Nothing at all. Just what the woman said. She said he looked suspicious. Raleigh hesitated. She said he looked off, quiet, like he was watching people. And you didn't question that. He exhaled slowly. I didn't think I had to. The investigator circled something on his notes. And that, he said, is the problem. Raleigh lowered his head. The sentence struck harder than any punishment. In the adjacent room, Officer Neil Watson told his own story. He admitted doubt. He admitted the moment he realized something was wrong, when the ID came back verified, when Aiden's tone shifted from compliance to command. He told the investigator about the tremor in his own hands when he removed the cuffs, about the weight of Aiden's words. Asterisk, now that you know, what you do next matters more. Asterisk, Watson's voice broke halfway through the retelling. He didn't justify himself. He didn't try. He simply said he was right. Back in the main hearing, the conversation deepened. Aiden outlined not just reforms, but the logic behind them, the why that institutions often forget. I'm not advocating for leniency, he explained. I'm advocating for precision. Systems that act out of fear produce chaos. Systems that act out of verification produce safety. Aiden's plan included 3 core principles. 1. Transparency *, all civilian complaints and detainments logged and accessible through public dashboards within 30 days. 2. Oversight *, independent review boards with legal power to audit actions without police veto. 3. Re-education *, mandatory bias recognition programs taught not as sensitivity training, but as legal competency training. Accountability, he concluded, is not a punishment. It's a prerequisite for trust. The words drew quiet nods from around the room. Even those who had walked in skeptical began to realize they weren't just hearing a defense. They were witnessing the construction of something new. Outside the building, protesters had gathered, not in anger, but in solidarity. Signs read, "We see you, Professor Baptiste," and *, "Justice has a blueprint." Among them were law students, civil rights advocates, and everyday travelers who had seen the video and couldn't let it go. The crowd was calm, reflective, mirroring the man at its center. Inside, one of the officials whispered, almost to herself, "I've never seen a scandal turn into policy this quickly." Aiden didn't respond. He simply looked down at the file before him. The proposal he'd written in his hotel room, jet-lagged, bruised, but determined. He had drafted it between dawn and noon, rewriting not just a document, but an idea that justice didn't need to roar to be heard. Sometimes, it just needed to be written clearly enough that no one could ignore it. That evening, after the hearing adjourned, Aiden returned to his suite overlooking the Thames. The city lights flickered against the water, indifferent yet eternal. He loosened his tie, opened his laptop, and began refining his draft. Emails poured in: academics, journalists, ministers, human rights groups. Some congratulated him. Others asked for advice. One came from a retired judge in Johannesburg who had once presided over apartheid tribunals. It read simply, "I thought I'd seen every kind of courage. I was wrong." Aiden smiled faintly, then returned to his work. He added a final clause to the Transit Justice Initiative. All personnel who execute searches or detainments without due cause and verification shall be placed on immediate suspension pending review. Then, beneath it, he wrote the line that would later echo through Parliament. We cannot fix what we refuse to document. We cannot restore trust in silence. He stared at the words for a long time, the city glowing faintly through the glass. It wasn't pride he felt, it was resolve. The following morning, the world reacted again. News outlets called it *, the Heathrow proposal. Others named it *, the Baptiste blueprint. Editorials debated it, governments discussed it, activists adopted it. But Aiden never called it after himself. When asked by a reporter outside his hotel what he hoped people would remember, he said only, "Not my name, just the change." Weeks passed. The proposal entered formal review. A special parliamentary committee was formed to study its adoption. Across Europe, airports began quietly auditing their own policies. Training manuals were rewritten. For the first time in decades, transit security wasn't just about threat prevention. It was about human dignity. At Heathrow, officers now carried new pocket guides, 3 laminated cards, verification protocol, bias check, and de-escalation ethics. None of them bore Aiden's name, but everyone knew where they came from. In a televised briefing, a journalist asked one of the airport directors, "Do you consider what happened to Professor Baptiste a failure of security or a failure of humanity?" The director paused, then replied, "Both. But the difference is, now we're documenting it." Meanwhile, inside a small classroom at the University of Cape Town, Aiden spoke before a room full of young law students. He had accepted a guest lecture invitation weeks prior, but now the hall overflowed. They weren't there to hear about the law. They were there to see what it looked like when lived. A student raised his hand. "Professor, after everything that happened, do you believe justice can still be blind?" Aiden smiled faintly. "The question," he said, "isn't whether the law can be blind. It's whether those enforcing it ever learn to see." The room went silent. And for the first time in a long time, Aiden felt something resembling peace. He hadn't sought fame. He hadn't demanded retribution. He had demanded reflection. And somehow the world had listened. Far above Heathrow, planes continued to lift through the clouds, their engines rumbling like distant thunder. Travelers still lined up at Gate B16, unaware that the ground beneath their feet had once been the epicenter of a global reckoning. And maybe that was the point. Justice, Aiden had always believed, was never about spectacle. It was about structure, about building systems so sound that no one had to question whether they worked. That was the legacy he wanted to leave behind. Not outrage, not memory, but a blueprint, one that would outlast the noise, the headlines, and even him. The sky above the courthouse was the color of old ash, gray, heavy, the kind of hue that lingers after fire has passed but still smells faintly of something burned. Outside its steps, people gathered quietly. No chants, no placards, no shouting, just conversation, low, reverent, like the hum of history being rewritten one sentence at a time. They weren't there to protest. They were there to remember, to speak the name Aiden Baptiste, the man who had walked through Heathrow Airport carrying nothing but a book, a boarding pass, and a calm mistaken for threat. The man whose quiet defiance had cracked the glass facade of a system that thought itself untouchable. What happened that morning at Gate B16 had become more than a scandal. It was a symbol, an echo that stretched far beyond one airport, one country, one man. It had forced governments to look at themselves, at the bias built into their laws, and at the fear still written between their policies. But for Aiden, it was never about vengeance. It was about repair. Weeks after the incident, he had spoken only once publicly, not at a press conference, not in a courtroom, but in a classroom at the University of Cape Town, before a room full of young law students. He didn't talk about the humiliation, the bruises, or the headlines. He talked about structure, how institutions erode from within when they forget who they serve. And then, in his quiet, deliberate voice, he asked a question that would travel farther than any news story ever could. The question isn't whether the law can be blind. It's whether those enforcing it ever learn to see. The students wrote it down. Journalists quoted it. Activists painted it on banners. One young public defender in Atlanta would later have the words tattooed on her arm. But Aiden never sought to be quoted. He wasn't chasing fame. He was chasing function. He didn't want to be remembered as a moment. He wanted to build something that lasted. Within months, that vision became real. He founded the Baptiste Center for Public Truth, a hybrid organization that blended law, media, and public advocacy. Its mission was simple: to hold institutions accountable through data, documentation, and direct action. The center didn't rely on spectacle. It relied on evidence. It didn't mobilize through outrage. It mobilized through proof. In its first 6 months, the Baptiste Center launched 4 major investigations into racial profiling at international transit hubs. It helped overturn 2 wrongful deportations. And it filed a legislative petition requiring independent oversight of passenger complaint procedures across 5 nations. But perhaps its quietest and most powerful achievement was the Silence Files, a public digital archive of civilian testimonies, stories from people who'd been profiled, detained, or dismissed simply for who they were. No commentary, no sensationalism, just truth documented. Each submission ended with a simple tagline chosen by Aiden himself: "We remember loudly." Aiden's days looked different now. He wasn't in courtrooms cross-examining ministers or standing before UN panels in polished halls. He was in community centers, civic halls, libraries, speaking to citizens, veterans, students, people who had lost faith in the law's humanity. He translated justice from Latin clauses into living language. He turned policy into something you could carry in your pocket. He told people that accountability wasn't abstract. It was personal. Everywhere he went, the same question followed: how did you stay calm? And his answer never changed. Because calm is not surrender. It's preparation. At the same time, the consequences for others were taking shape. Officer Neil Watson was suspended, then reassigned to a civilian review program. He cooperated with internal investigators, giving testimony that confirmed procedural flaws and unverified reporting chains. He would later become one of the first officers certified under the new Transit Justice Initiative, the very framework born from Aiden's proposal. When asked why he returned to service, Watson said quietly, "He looked me in the eye and said what I did next would matter. This is me proving it does." Officer Luke Raleigh wasn't as fortunate. Internal Affairs charged him with misconduct, unlawful detainment, and falsified reporting. The tribunal found him guilty on all counts. The ruling was public. His name trended for days, accompanied by the same image that had defined the story: the professor in the gray coat, standing calm while Raleigh looked away. When the judge read the verdict, Raleigh didn't protest. He just sat there, staring at his hands, realizing too late that control built on prejudice collapses under truth. And then there was Veronica Hall, the woman whose whisper had set it all in motion. She faced no criminal charges, but she faced something heavier: exposure. Her name became synonymous with a question whispered by journalists and echoed across social media. What did you see, and what did it cost? Her social circles dissolved. Her husband retreated from public life. She stopped attending galas, stopped flying first class. The same gaze she once cast upon others now turned inward. Years later, in an interview with a local paper, she said only, "I didn't mean harm. I just felt uncomfortable." The reporter's response, printed beneath her quote, was stark. So did he. Through it all, Aiden never once mentioned her name. Not in interviews, not in lectures, not in private. He had no interest in assigning blame to an individual when an entire system was guilty. Anger, he once said to a colleague, is a reaction. Justice is direction. By the following year, governments across Europe had begun adopting elements of the Transit Justice Initiative. In the UK, the Ministry of Transport approved an independent civilian oversight board for airports. In France, officers were required to complete yearly anti-bias certification to maintain active status. In Canada, Aiden's model for chain of validation reporting became federal law. Heathrow, the site of the original incident, became the first international hub to implement every element of the reform. Each gate, including B16, now carried a small plaque etched with a quote from the framework: "Security without accountability is fear pretending to be safety." Travelers took photos of it. Some cried when they read it. Others simply stood there for a moment, silent, thoughtful, before moving on. A whisper had turned into a warning carved in steel. But Aiden's influence didn't stop at airports. Universities began teaching the Heathrow case as part of law ethics curriculums. Human rights organizations used it to train investigators in verifying implicit bias. Even corporate sectors referenced it when drafting diversity compliance models. And through it all, Aiden stayed consistent. He refused to capitalize on his fame. He didn't sign book deals, didn't seek interviews, didn't start a foundation in his name. He stayed exactly as he had always been: measured, private, deliberate. He was, as one journalist described him, a man who changed the world without ever raising his voice. Years later, during a televised symposium on justice reform, a young moderator asked him, "Professor Baptiste, do you ever think about that morning, about how differently it could have gone?" Aiden paused, his expression soft. "Every day," he said, "but not with regret, with responsibility. Because if I had lost my temper, they would have written a different headline, and it would have buried the truth instead of exposing it." The audience sat silent. Cameras zoomed in on his hands that had once been restrained in metal. He continued, "You don't have to yell to be heard. You just have to stand. Stand in your knowledge. Stand in your grace. Stand in the unshakable belief that silence isn't surrender and calm isn't weakness." By now, the Baptiste Center for Public Truth had grown beyond him. It had branches in London, New York, and Nairobi. It trained advocates in legal storytelling, turning personal testimonies into data-backed policy reform. It offered workshops on documenting injustice safely, verifying evidence, and using digital media for transparency. The center's digital archive, the Silence Files, had grown to over 8,000 verified entries, each one reviewed and cross-checked by volunteers around the world. Every month, the center released a report highlighting trends in racial or identity-based profiling across global transit systems. And at the bottom of every report, beneath the charts and statistics, one line remained constant. Asterisk, justice begins when we start keeping the receipts. Asterisk, despite his growing influence, Aiden lived simply. He owned no luxury car, no lavish home. His apartment overlooked the Thames, a small space filled with books, case notes, and old postcards from students and colleagues. He cooked for himself. He walked to work. He still preferred paperback novels to screens. When people asked why he hadn't moved on or taken a break, he smiled faintly. Because progress doesn't rest, he'd say, and neither should those who believe in it. One autumn morning, Aiden stood again inside Heathrow. The terminal looked the same, steel beams, glass walls, the low hum of movement, but it felt different now. He stopped at gate B16. Travelers bustled past without recognizing him. He didn't mind. On the wall beside the gate, a brass plaque caught his eye. He stepped closer and read it. Asterisk, in honor of Professor Aiden Baptiste, whose calm exposed injustice and whose truth redefined accountability. May we always look again before we judge. Asterisk, he smiled, quietly, almost sadly. A security officer nearby noticed him reading. It's quite a story, isn't it? The officer said, not realizing who he was. Happened years ago. Changed everything here. Aiden turned, nodding slightly. Yes, he said. It did. And then he walked away, disappearing into the crowd like any other traveler. That evening, back at his office, he sat beneath a warm desk lamp reviewing new submissions to the silence files. One was from a young woman detained at an airport in Madrid for appearing nervous. Another from an elderly man stopped at a border checkpoint because his name sounded foreign. Aiden read each story slowly, marking patterns, connecting threads. To him, every story was a data point, every data a point of direction. When he finished, he closed the file and whispered to himself, "We're not done yet." Then he leaned back, looking out the window at the glowing city below. Its bridges lit, its noise distant, its heartbeat steady. The world had moved on, but the work hadn't. And in that realization, he found peace, not because everything was fixed, but because everything could still be. Months later, Parliament would quote his words on the floor during a session on civil reform. We cannot fix what we refuse to document. We cannot restore trust in silence. Those words would be engraved above the entrance of the newly established International Office of Transit Accountability, the institution his story had birthed. But by then, Aiden wasn't attending ceremonies. He was mentoring interns, drafting papers, writing quiet letters to people who'd reached out to him for help. He understood something most people didn't. The work of justice doesn't end when the world applauds. It ends when the world no longer needs reminding. As years passed, the story of Heathrow became something like a legend. Not a viral scandal, not a tragic cautionary tale, but a study in resilience. Older citizens would tell their grandchildren, he was the man who stayed calm when the world wasn't. Law students studied Baptiste v. Heathrow Authority as the case that redefined civil oversight. And in airports across the world, new officers were trained under the clause known informally as the Baptiste Principle. Assume truth before threat. In the end, that was Aiden's quiet victory. Not revenge, not recognition, but restoration. He had shown the world that silence could carry power, that composure could be protest, and that dignity could be louder than accusation. Because Aiden Baptiste didn't just survive that airport. He rewrote the rules for what happens after. And that, perhaps, is why his name will never fade. He never entered Heathrow that morning expecting to make history. He wasn't chasing headlines, wasn't declaring war, wasn't even speaking loudly enough to be noticed. He simply wanted what everyone wants, a safe flight and the dignity of moving through the world without being reduced to suspicion. But the world didn't see his degrees, his service, or his humanity. It saw his skin. It saw its own fear reflected back. And that whisper, one that began in ignorance, unraveled into a revelation. A whisper became a complaint. A complaint became a report. A report became handcuffs. But through it all, Aiden never lost control. He didn't shout. He didn't beg. He didn't flinch. He stood in his truth. And in doing so, he forced the truth into daylight. The question his story left behind wasn't just what happened to him, but what happens every day to those who don't have his platform, his title, or his protection. That question became a movement. That movement became reform. And that reform became legacy. So, if you're hearing this story now, remember this. Dignity isn't earned through title or power. It's a birthright. And in a world that still judges too quickly and listens too slowly, we each have a duty to see, to question, to speak when silence costs lives. Because the fight for justice doesn't begin in courtrooms. It begins in moments like these, in the quiet choices, in the calm refusals, in the decision to stand rather than yield. Aiden Baptiste proved that calm can be louder than outrage. That silence, when filled with purpose, can change the world. And as long as his story is told, no whisper, no prejudice, no act of fear disguised as duty will ever be safe in silence again.